Thank you so much for bearing with us. We're having a little bit of technical difficulties here this evening, but all of the local videos that you saw and the one that you didn't see will be on rotation on WQLN PBS in anticipation of continuing the 7th season of Finding Your Roots, which starts on April 13th. So as promised, I have this fabulous panel joining me tonight. We have Ms. Marva Keys Morris. Hi, Marva. Will you introduce
Hello.
yourself? Will you introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure. My name is Marva Keys Morris, and I was born in Erie, PA. I've lived in the New York Metro and Detroit Metro, but I'm back home now. I love Erie. I'm an entrepreneur. Currently am running a small beverage company. So I'm entrepreneurial and I really enjoy what I do. I have four beautiful adult children and I think now 7 grandchildren.
Great. Well, thanks again for joining us. We
Mhm.
also have Dr. Rhonda Matthews. Thank you for joining us tonight. Can you introduce yourself to the audience?
Yes, good evening, everyone. My name is Rhonda Matthews. I am a professor of politics at Edinburgh University. I'm a political sociologist. But I come here tonight as a person who is interested in history and specifically in genealogical history of ethnic communities, specifically Black communities. So that's why I'm here.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for joining us. We also have Mr. Johnny Johnson, another familiar face from the local videos. Hi, Johnny. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, my name is Johnny Johnson. I've been a resident of Erie for 51 years. I came up in 1970 to become a teacher here in Erie. I retired in 2004. I taught 34 and a half years. I've done a lot of things in African American history here in Erie and also in my hometown in Covington, Georgia.
Wonderful. Thanks for being here. And of course, we have Dr. Leslie Sotomayor here. I hope I said that right, Leslie. My apologies if I didn't.
Perfect.
Okay, great. Thanks. Would you introduce yourself to the audience, please?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm an art educator at Edinburgh University. I'm an artist and curator as well. And I'm also president of the Chroma Guild, that is through Erie Arts and Culture, that is to build community and solidarity with our underrepresented artists and creative members of our community. So I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
Thanks for being here. I love the mural behind you, by the way.
Yes.
Great.
All right. Well, I have a couple questions here. And the audience, if you have any questions for our panelists, please drop them in the chat for us. I'm going to start with Marva. Marva, how did you learn about your ancestry? Was it passed down through your family or did you do some research? Tell me a little bit about how you found out about your ancestry.
Well, Joycelyn, actually, it was a combination of all three. My family does biannual family reunions, which are held all over the United States, but mostly where we originated from. We actually originated from North Carolina, but most of the family settled in Mississippi. So we usually have our reunions in Mississippi, Detroit, Cleveland, and we kind of rotate. But in addition to that, I became very interested in my family roots because my grandfather was a slave. He was born around 1872. He was a little boy when slavery ended, and his first wife died, and he had a second family. My father is the baby of that second family, born to him in his mid-40s. His father was in his mid-40s. And then I am the baby of my father and mother. And I was born to him and my mother. He was 52 And my mother was 48, God bless her. But because of their age, me being the baby of my family, I come from a family of 6. I was obviously a change of life baby, and everyone had left the roost. So I was actually able to talk to my mother and father, ask them a lot of questions, and they weren't as busy because they weren't raising a young family. And the third thing that happened is I got very interested in history and wanted to start researching. So I started asking other people in the community. I started going to the library and accessing different libraries and speaking to some of the older people in the family.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I'm going to move on to Johnny. Um, Tell me, Johnny, why is it so important to you to know about your ancestry? Not only just you personally, but us as a culture. What do you think?
Well, I think it's very important for all of us to know where our roots are. And I'm just use this example, kind of like when I was in science and we talked about one cell animals and 2-cell animals and how all these cells come together to form an organism. Well, ancestry is an organism. You get all these pieces together and you find the big piece. It's very important, and I'm going to say this at this time because we have this word that's called cancel culture or whatever they want to call it now. And one of the things that I want to say is that our culture has always been canceled. We have never been brought to the forefront. We have been set aside as a non-entity. So it's very important for us as we move forward to understand, number one, who we are. But more important than who we are is what we are. That's very important. And I can say my great-grandfather was born in 1863. He was born a slave. Most of the things that I learned from my family is that we had neighborhoods, we had communities. And you would sit around the fireplace and you would bake potatoes and you would parch peanuts and you would do all those things that people did in the South. And you have these great conversations about what happened here, what happened there. They give you the entire lineage of your aunts, your uncle, and who went over there and who went over there. So it was like a great storybook, but not with true stories, not fallacies. Mm-hmm. And in our ancestry, that's what we're looking for. We look for true stories.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Thank you for that. Dr. Sotomayor, you are the curator for the Cuban American Cultural Exchange. Tell me what prompted you to be a part of something so iconic.
Absolutely. So my mother is Cuban, and she arrived in the United States from Cuba in the late 1960s. And I grew up all my life. So my mother from Cuba, my father from Puerto Rico, and I grew up throughout my childhood and adolescence having very close connection to my Puerto Rican side, right? So traveling back and forth between the mainland and the island, knowing my family, my stories like Johnny was just talking about my ancestry and heritage, right? Spanish is my first language. So having a very close paternal lineage tie. And with my mother's Cuban side, although very much aware and a vital integral part to my everyday experience and our culture, I had a very different experience, right? Mm-hmm. She only had one sister at the time here in the United States and, 10 siblings back in Cuba. Her parents, she had left them behind there. So there was this disconnect and this segregation and dislocation, right? When she decided to migrate to the United States, which is not an uncommon story, right? And I think we all here probably represent that in a variety of ways. But I grew up with this void, this void in my heart and in my life of not hearing these stories from my mother's memories and her experiences, but imagining who these people were that I had never met. And so I had this longing that I feel I was born with. I feel that it gestated and grew in the womb with my mother. This longing of knowing who my people were, and are, and another component of my culture and my heritage. So in 2011, in my early 30s, I had the opportunity to go to Cuba for the first time as an adult, and that radically changed my life. I met my maternal family, my cousins and aunts and uncles. I went to the tombs of my grandparents in 2011 in Santiago de Cuba. And that impacted, I was only there for 5 days, but it impacted my life in such a way that I had to go back. I had to go back, and I had to do everything that was in my power to trace my ancestral lineage. And I wanted to know, who were these people? How did they get to Cuba? And so in, condensing that story significantly, in response to this very large question, that experience was what led me to go to the archives in Cuba to trace my ancestry. I wanted to know, my maternal grandmother was Lebanese. So I'm meeting my aunts and uncles for the first time. They're showing me pictures of family members that have long passed, stories that have been passed down, and little bits and pieces of data that I start writing down and collecting. And through those pieces is when I started documenting, okay, they came, from Lebanon. They arrived, through, this port in Santiago de Cuba in the early 1900s. And so I started piecing those things together. And throughout that experience, I'm also meeting many other people, right? A lot of Cubans, artists and curators and historians and educators, and, and so I start recognizing through those conversations that although our stories may be very unique, they have a common thread, the thread of wanting to know who we were, who we are, what our past is about, and where we're going, right? Because you can't know where you're going if you don't know where you've come from. And so it was through those conversations that this seed idea came about. How can we create a visual culture and poetry tying a lot of these loose threads into a cultural exchange and exhibit between the United States and Cuba? And so that's where it kind of grew from and gestated, and took on its own living life form, between Havana, Santiago de Cuba, and central Pennsylvania, out of all places.
That's amazing. Thank you for that. And we have a special treat tonight because I was privy to some information a few months back that Dr. Matthews is working on a new project, and we are able to tell what that project is. So Rhonda, would you like to fill our audience in on some of the wonderful things that are happening in your world?
I absolutely would, and thank you for the opportunity to do so. So what Ms. Morris and Dr. Sotomayor and Mr. Johnson all talked about was, is history. And it's not just personal history, even though each one of them talked about their personal histories. What they're really talking about is the history of the United States. And the histories that they are talking about are often overlooked. My own personal story is that I am a native of Los Angeles. My mom and her family are from Mississippi. Another area, what Ms. Morris was talking about, that area that she's from is closer to central Mississippi. My mom's hometown is closer to is in northern Mississippi. But she left there to go to college she left Starkville to go to college in Los Angeles, where my grandmother's sister lived right down the street. She went to be with family, even though she went halfway across the country. She was there to be with family. So my brothers and I were born and raised in Los Angeles. Well, until at least about the age of 16. We left when I was 15 and moved to a smaller town in Southern California. And then spent some time in Rochester, New York. And then it was at that point that my parents divorced. And when they divorced, or when they separated, my mom moved us to Mississippi. And so it's from that point on that most of my life has been spent somewhere in a Southern state. But here's what happened when I moved to Mississippi. Those stories that Mr. Johnson was talking about, just being part of everyday life and interaction, started happening more to me because we were in the neighborhood that my mom was raised in. And so it instilled in me this sense of history. And I've taken that wherever I've gone. So my family has been in Erie now for about 7 years. Prior to that, we lived in Meadville for almost 20 years. And what I noticed was an omission, right? There is an omission of the histories of many of the people in Erie who have helped to make it what it is. And so I constructed a project in working with Erie's Black Wall Street and the Hagen History Center called the Lest We Forget Initiative. And what this initiative seeks to do is to fill in those gaps of knowledge through collecting histories, people's individual histories, stories, collecting artifacts and or documents that are important to the communities that whose stories are not told here. The plan is for the Lest We Forget initiative to be a multi-year project. A multi-year initiative with every year there being a project focused on one community in Erie. And we are starting with the Black community. And so the partnership with the Hagen History Center is important because they are an institution of history. In fact, they are the premier institution of history in Erie. As such, it is their goal to tell the entire history of Erie and to fill in those gaps of knowledge. And so we are beginning the process of starting to interview members of the Black community to ask for either donations of historical artifacts to the Hagen History Center for safekeeping and restoration and for permanent display, or the lending of such artifacts so that we can begin to broaden these tales about this city and how it came to be who it is, what it is, who represents the city. We all do. But the problem in history and archival research is that often we only see a really small sliver of the history of the people who made history in the city. And when we broaden it, we can tell the whole tale. A history that is incomplete is a lie. And so what we want to do, what Erie's Black Wall Street and the Hagen History Center seek to do with this project is to fill in those gaps.
Excellent. I'm so excited for you and this project.
Thank you. I am too. I really am. We all need to feel, it's not just that we are all part of the community. We all need to be a part of the community in institutional ways. We all need to feel like we are part of the community, and we all need to see that we are a part of the community. And Erie's Black Wall Street and the Hagen History Center are committed to doing just that.
That's great. That's great. All right, so I'm going to take a look at some of the audience questions here, and these are up for grabs. So please, if you have anything to say about these, please jump in. I have one from an anonymous audience member. It says, how do I trace my 1% Ghana heritage? Other audience members have asked how to research other low percentage DNA matches as well. So have any of you panelists encountered any roadblocks while learning about your family history? And if so, do you have any tips for these audience members?
If I may say, I've had DNA done by several different companies. And one thing that you have to be aware of is that a lot of times these are not factual. You know, like when I did mine, it had me more in Great Britain than I was in an African country. And I knew that that definitely could not have been true. So what you have to do is you definitely have to be aware of that. And here again, too, the most important thing is if you have any oral history at all, follow that oral history. Follow that oral history. Go to ancestry.com. Go to those census. Do all those things. It takes time and it's hard work, but that's where you really get the meat of what you want to do.
Can I want to talk about the ancestry, the cheek swab test. One of the things that's important to note is that you really need to figure out how they're doing their test and what their population is. So one of the reasons that Mr. Johnson got the results that he got is probably because a lot of those companies use the sample only of the swabs that they have gotten. Right? So if they have 500 people and the vast majority of those people are from Great Britain or have an ancestry in Great Britain, your DNA test is likely to show up with that kind of result. So it's really important to know what the sample looks like, how broad a range of people they have who've given them cheek swabs, right? And the broader the diversity of people in the population, the more accurate your test is, your results are going to be. And I forgot the other thing I was going to say. You said something else, Mr. Johnson. I cannot remember. It'll come back to me.
I know it will.
I think another important component, at least when tracing my ancestry, I had to educate myself on the historical context of the time frames that I was looking at, and the political context, right? So understanding how were people being labeled as they were coming into different ports from Arab Mediterranean countries into Cuba, in my instance, right? What ports were they coming into, and what numbers? How were they being labeled and identified? Because what I found out is that the categories were so broad. So if you were coming in and you were Arab looking, right, Mediterranean looking, you were labeled as Turkish, Egyptian, or Syrian, right? And so I had to unpack that information further by looking at, all right, historically, where are we at, right, on this map? What was happening politically? What were the implications to that, to these groups of people? And I would also say that what Johnny and Dr. Matthews mentioned about, totally slipped my mind just now. Too many thoughts
at least you're not alone. We're all in it together.
Well, that's okay. That's the first thing that goes, right?
Yeah. But looking at the oral history and documenting that as best as you can by recording it with audio and transcribing was really important for my documentation, because I was able to put together, well, they thought this, they remember hearing this language, this, this dialect of a language, or these words. Or one of the clues for me was the dishes that my grandmother would cook, that my aunts would remember. I was able to make some connections between some of those things to the cultural context that she might have been coming from in northern Lebanon. So those little things that might seem like, oh, cute little tidbits of stories, can be real footprints, in trying to figure out and mapping that.
Right. And that's how we piece together our family history. We actually go back to the port of entry from when we came into the United States. And it would be my great grandfather. His name was Bill. And Bill was hired out, and I hate to use this word, as a stud. He fathered 152 babies with different women. And we actually, my one cousin is a professor down in New Orleans, and he made it his project to find all of those different trees of our family. So I showed it to Joycelyn when I was in the studio. It's actually a family tree of every branch of one of his children that we could find. We're still finding branches out of that tree. And so it's unfortunate, though, in the African-American community, slaves, they didn't keep slave logs of names. They said, buck male, very unflattering names, but they weren't actual names of people. And so for African Americans, the only thing we can do is to actually go back and look at the surnames that we have, which is actually the names of the slaveholders. And in my instance, my father's, my paternal family, it was Keys. And so we've even tried to find some of the slave masters' records, because some of the slave masters kept better records than others. So my cousin, who's getting old now, I guess he's probably in his 80s now, he did a very, very good job of journaling the information that we have so far. And every time we meet someone, we ask, if they have the same name of Keys, and if they're African American, we ask the question, where's your family from? So we've been able to pick up different branches of the tree, going back, as I said to you, to my great grandfather, who, as I said, was hired out as a stud. He had, according to our branch, he had 152 children, and we're still, as I said, trying to find all of those, and we have it cataloged. So our family actually went a little step further and put a committee together. So my cousin, who's now in his 80s, I think it's his granddaughter, she's actually working on a film. If you've seen the movie called Jones County, Mississippi, a lot of the stories in that is about our family. Our family ended up settling, for the most part, in Hoy, Mississippi. So the story behind that is my grandfather, the one that was a slave, when my father was around 6 years old, he was murdered by a mob of white men who killed him over his property. He had 500 acres. And this isn't a story, as Johnny said, we want real stories. This is told every biannually at our family reunion. This history is read. And so all the land that he had was taken. My father and his sister, his older sister, Etta, were parceled off and sent to aunts and uncles around, an aunt and an uncle around. And my father was orphaned because his mother had died from what they called consumption. I didn't know what consumption was. I looked it up. I guess it's something like pneumonia, but she had already died. So my father was orphaned. And this happened over and over again in the African American community. But answering your question, it's also important to try to ask questions when you meet people who you think might be related to you, and see what where they come from. And then you can take, as you said, Dr. Sotomayor, you can take that information and that can be a trail to more information about your history and your roots.
May I just add on to what Marv just said? It's very important for us to realize that a lot of people did not come into the United States as Black people came into the United States. We came into the United States as slaves. There was something in the United States called slavery. Most people want to forget about those two words, slavery and slaves, okay? So when you began to look in the census, you would not find in the South any Black names from the time slavery started up until the 1870 census. You may find a Black person name. Other than that, you were a wench, or as you say, a buck, and you were labeled by the type of job that you had, dishwasher, house, whatever. You did not have a name. It was not until the 1870 census in the South that you began to have names. And a lot of times those names were misspelled. They weren't even your name. It was just something that they stuck down there. Also remember, as you began to research, the census of 1890 was burned. There's no census from 1890. So you got this big space from 1880 to 1900 where you could miss 100 relatives, and that's the hard part when you say, hey, this is what I want to do about my genealogy, because a lot of those times you're going to run into roadblocks that you can't get over.
Can I say this too? One of the things I think is important to remember, or the connection that's important to make, is between a lot of the stories that we hear in families and broader social patterns. So Ms. Morris just talked about her relative who was killed for his land. That's really important to understand, because that is not an isolated incident. In many instances, it was the motivation for lynching. Because if you killed the person who owned the land and terrorized the rest of their family further, they would leave. And then the land would, through our legal systems, be put up for sale and parceled out, and the parcels of the land would be split up and sold to the very same people who murdered the owner of the land. And that is one of the ways that we see less and less ownership of land in Black communities, not just land, but property writ large in Black families, in a smaller sense, and then Black communities writ large. So part of the dialogue that we hear about a lot of the different ethnic communities in the United States are just ignorant of those facts. For instance, there's lots of criticism about Black wealth and the ways in which Black people are able, or in more accurately, unable to accumulate wealth, go back to that, right? That's a historical pattern. So people often don't know about that when they make these kinds of comments in the present day about Black entrepreneurship, Black home ownership, Black property ownership writ large. So this is another reason why knowing these stories is important, because those stories connect to modern day patterns.
And if I may add to what Dr. Rhonda said, there was something called 40 acres and a mule, and most of that happened around South Carolina and Georgia and islands.
Mm-hmm.
And these people had this land, they were promised this land, and this land was taken from them.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you go from 40 acres to a mule, you come up with something that people don't want to hear, which is reparations.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's look at what you just said about people killing people, taking land, et cetera, et cetera. So at what point in time do this word that everybody is afraid of in the United States, when it comes to Black people, you're not afraid of it with other people, but why are you afraid of this word called reparation?
Mm-hmm.
If people work free for you from 1619 up until now, you're working for $7.25 an hour, so it's still free. So why don't you think that these people deserve the rewards of their labor?
An excellent point. Thank you all so much for your insight to that question. In another audience question, or some audience members have mentioned that they want to help their young children learn about their ancestry. Is teaching your children something that you consider when you work to keep your family stories alive?
Yes.
Well, let me just say this. I had no problem because grandmama and granddaddy were still living, so I didn't have a problem because these stories was told around the fireplace and etc. Okay,
Right.
Today it's entirely different, and I hate to say this, but I have to tell the truth. You have kids who mine are on PS5, PS6, PS7, so on and so forth, that when you begin to tell them something that's really, really important, they may push it to the side. So I would say, like I did with my kids when we were growing up in Erie, every summer, from the time that they were 4 or 5 years old, we would take a trip home. And we would visit everybody's house, everybody tell their story, so that my kids would know what these stories are, know what role that they played and I played in those stories. So it's very important to sit down, turn the TV off, turn off LeBron and all these people, P. Diddy and all those people, and sit down and say, hey, let's talk about us for a while. Even if you have to go to the library and get books and say, hey, I need you to read this, I need you to read that. And it's a lot different now. When I grew up, you had Jet and Ebony magazine. So you always had this Black history flowing and coming into your house. Now you don't have that as much.
Well, one of the reasons that I'm starting the initiative is for that reason, to make sure that that these histories, that these stories are present. They are somewhere in the public sphere, right? That they have been taken care of, that they have been, that artifacts have been restored, that people get an opportunity to see them, that they are public, that they are part of what it is that we know, not just as children, but as adults as well. That these stories are written, right? So one of the ways that I learned history was from the stories, right? Because even though I wasn't raised in the South, my great aunt was right down the street. And so there was still some Mississippi in Los Angeles. So I did have a connection, but more importantly, my mom made sure that there were books in the house so that we could read up on Black history. There was an encyclopedia, it was called the Encyclopedia of Negro History, right? It was just in the house. So, if you got bored, you're sitting there, you could read a page or two about someone who had invented something, someone who was important to the history of the United States, right? So it was kind of always an important thing in our home, just because it was always there, right? I knew it was important because it was there. And being able to collect these stories and put them in the public sphere I think is going to help a lot of people do the very thing that Mr. Johnson was talking about. It'll help you socialize your children into a history that used to be hidden.
In my instance, my mother was somewhat of a, well, she was an educator, but so she liked to collect a lot of family pictures and things like that. She never got a chance to teach in the North. She was a one room school teacher in Mississippi.
Mhm.
And as you know, in women back in 1930, 40, that was a big deal to be a school teacher.
Mhm.
But so she knew the value of history, and she collected a lot of photos, which I have shared a lot of those. Minister Johnson has seen a lot of those photos. As a result of that, I have pictures going back like to 18, I guess, like I have a picture of my great aunt, which was my mother's aunt, who was born in the late 1800s. So what I do is when my grandchildren come over, I pull out an album and we talk about the photos. We have little family time. And when they get bored, I let them do something else. But almost every time they come over to visit, I
Mhm.
want them to see who their ancestors are. And so now they're asking me questions like, Grandma, that lady you showed me, um, was she a slave? You know, that might seem like a very strange question, but for a little kid, they're wanting to know the linkage between Black America, their families, and how they came from slaves, and how did that, in their little minds, how did that impact them? So I just try to spend time with the younger ones. The older ones have already got it. They attended the family reunions that we had. They we used to go on family vacations to visit family out of town. And I think keeping that communication between cousins
Mhm.
is important as well. Just trying to stay in the loop with your family.
I would also add that as an educator, drawing from these lived experiences, right? And being able to have conversations in different learning environments about like what Marva just mentioned about the psychological impact, right? And I think a lot of times these aren't discussions that we have, especially not in philosophical or academic circles, right? But learning about how these histories of our lived experiences that have either been firsthand experience, generational, witnessed, impact who we are as a people. And beyond ourselves and our individual, how it impacts our collective and and the social issues that we're engaging in the United States in 2021 have everything to do with everything we're talking about now, right? And so that's another form of education through formal and informal spaces.
Mhm.
Mhm.
If I could also add, history is something that you build upon. There's a foundation, and then you begin to build upon it. And one of my great experiences, not just within my family, because all of my sisters was teachers, is that the point that I went to an HBCU.
Mhm.
And for most people who don't know what an HBCU is, that's Historical Black College University. So when you leave high school and you have all this family history, now you go to HBCU and you have a cumulative history of everything that you need to
Mhm.
know. Okay. And
Mhm.
that's to me was one of the most important things that you could do to build up this historical framework that each one of us need.
And also, let me jump on the HBCU bandwagon. Um, One of the things that was very important about my undergraduate education is that when I took a history course, you know that when, for those of you who've gone to college, you know, everybody has to take that history 101 course, and then you have to take history 102. So you have a year's worth of history. It always included a wide range of history. We did not just
Right.
learn about rich white men. We learned about Black folks. We learned about indigenous people. We learned about people from various Latino countries. We learned, I mean, it was broad ranging. That changes your perspective too. Because most people don't get that. They get a really narrow, you know, slice of history that is not at all complete. So I absolutely agree. I'd like
Right.
to see more of that in schools that are not HBCU.
Right. And you know, if I could say this, and I tell people this, one of the greatest things to me about going to HBCU is that we had diversity.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We had teachers who was Muslim, we had teachers, all of that. So you're on the campus of, let's say, 2,000 kids, and you're interacting with these people.
Mm-hmm.
They get to know you, you get to know them, and your outlook on who people are and what people are entirely changes. You know, you are not in a vacuum where you see something so small. Now you see the big picture.
Mm-hmm.
You guys have been amazing. These are absolutely fascinating histories that you tell so well, and they're such an important way to understand the collective history. I thank you so much for sharing with us here tonight, Dr. Matthews, Dr. Sotomayor, Ms. Marva, Ms. Morris, and Mr. Johnson. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. And to our audience, we're so glad you took time out of your day to spend with us here tonight. And thanks to our partners again, Edinburgh University, Hagen History Center, Erie Arts and Culture, and Erie County Public Library. The library has great assets for you to be able to do this on your own. There is a link to a survey in the chat. Please fill this out so that we may continue to improve upon these virtual events going forward. And you can catch Finding Your Roots Tuesdays at 8 p.m. on WQLN PBS, with the 7th season picking it back up on April 13th. From all of us here at WQLN, be safe, be well, and have a great night. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye.